Delegate from Norfolk, Delegate Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the House, I have wrestled deeply over the subject matter of this speech today, but the last 3 weeks have prompted significant amount of thought and reflection with family, friends, colleagues, peers, and debate within myself. Today I am speaking as an almost 30-year-old lifelong resident of this Commonwealth who happens to be a delegate with a platform. I speak for nobody else but myself, no caucus or particular group within this body or around the state. Over the last several weeks, deep wounds have been opened within Virginia, sparking conversation and examination of a topic that often brings about a significant amount of discomfort when we talk about it, and that's race here in the Commonwealth. Some people say race is used as a boogeyman. Some people say they try to use it for their advantage. I stand before you here today to tell you like it is. Make no mistake, I have spent the last few weeks alternating between anger, grief, angst, despair, physical and emotional pain. For long stretches, I have remained silent, unable to summon the words that accurately describe what is on my heart and how I've been feeling. But people have called and texted, and I have appreciated all of that. I decided to speak today because of another reaction that I've heard personally and seen in the media. The reaction of one of surprise that things like blackface and other expressions of racism and white supremacy still occurred in our society in the 1980s and even today. That surprise has been a luxury to many Virginians, most of them white. For many of us in this chamber and millions of people around the country, the events have gripped Virginia. They weren't an aberration, an abstraction, or an anachronism. They aren't a unit in a history book. To me, and many people like me, these events are a window into a struggle that defines daily life for Black Americans from the day we are born until the day we die. I thought about my experience as a Black man in this Commonwealth and the history of my family, the Joneses and the Simmonses, and they are my Black history spotlight today. As the grandson and son of men and women who spent the entirety of their lives attempting to fight the horrors of racism in Virginia, I have long been acquainted with the pain and suffering of people of color in this state. As a child, my family made sure that I was aware that slaves were brought to Virginia against their will, that they were treated as inhuman, partial people who were not worthy of consideration as anything more than property. They made sure that I was aware that a bitter conflict erupted in this country, in large part because some folks believed that slaves should be free and others did not. They made sure that I knew that even after the war, Blacks weren't even close to being treated equally under the eyes of the law or in the eyes of other people around this country. That somewhere along the way, slaves from the American South had children who ended up in Virginia. That those people became my grandparents and parents. My grandparents, whose only option for education was a historically Black college, chose Virginia State University in Petersburg. My grandfather, Hillary H. Jones, Jr., wanted to be an attorney, but couldn't go to law school in Virginia because they didn't allow Black people to attend. He had to borrow other students' bar preparation materials because the law libraries wouldn't lend him the books. And this was in the 1940s, after he had gone to Italy to serve his country in World War II in the Italian theater. He passed the bar, and he and my grandmother returned to Norfolk, only to be shunned by the majority of the population as second-class citizens. So they dedicated themselves to righting wrongs, to fight for equality and justice, to make sure their children did not endure the same struggles that they did. On the other side, my mother's parents, Margaret and Charles Simmons, moved to Norfolk so that my grandfather could teach at Norfolk State University, because back then, a white university wouldn't dare hire him as a professor. They too got involved in the struggle for justice, just like my other set. They served as a test case for the YMC Beach Club and were rejected because of the color of their skin. My grandparents took my mother and her siblings on a road trip across the country through the segregated South, which is their home, only to run into the same treatment that all Black folk felt that along the way. They used the Green Book that Delegate Ward so eloquently spoke about just a couple of days ago. Despite my grandparents' effort to build a life for their children that was equal and just, my parents endured their fair share of racism throughout their journey as well. My father and his two brothers integrated Ingleside Elementary School in Norfolk in 1960, when my dad was just 6, only to be treated with jeers and chants of "nigger, go home." 20 years ago on this very same floor, my father spoke against the placement of the Confederate flag on a license plate. He recalled seeing a cross burning as a child with the Confederate flag waving alongside of it. Some of the members in this chamber today were there and felt the searing pain and raw emotion that my father felt on that day in 1960. He was just a young boy filled with fear and all that burning cross connotated. To him and others, these symbols mean hate and vitriolic racism. I remember vividly the hate mail that we received at our home for months afterwards after that speech. But my family's history of fighting civil rights or enduring racism isn't particularly unique. I share it because it illustrates the central point I hope to make today. It is part of Virginia's history, whether we like it or not. And it is certainly part of our Black history that I believe must be shared. For people like me, the dark history of Virginia and the fight to change it are not confined to history books or remembrances around Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. That struggle is personal and intimate to me and my family as my grandmother's recipe for succotash or my father's love of jazz music. And despite generations of suffering and sacrifice, my own life has been impacted by the overt and covert racism that has haunted us for hundreds of years. And it wasn't always the racism that was thrown in my face, but it was also the casual racism, the subtle comments, the jokes from white acquaintances who had the luxury of thinking about race as fodder for humor. Indeed, I carried with me to this day a memory associated with this hallowed body. I recall a moment from my childhood at a General Assembly retreat with both Democrats and Republicans in attendance. And I was playing with other children of legislators. As we played, our group was approached by another legislative significant other who looked at me and then told her little girl, "Don't play with him because he's Black." As a young boy, I may have not gotten it then, but I certainly get it now, and it still stays with me. Even as a young Black man in today's world, which my forebears had hoped to be one of equality, I cannot stand here and say that my experience has been markedly different than the generations before me. The hurt, the anguish, the pain remains all the same. But my family stories and my stories are but one small part of that lasting anguish, pain, and fear that we have faced in our lifetimes. While our experiences have varied, I guarantee you that generations of Black Virginians can tell you story after story after story that merges into a common theme. All you have to do is ask them, and their stories will allow you to see a larger picture. That history and experience brings us to the current moment in the Commonwealth. I know we are all struggling together to grapple with the events of the past few weeks and what we say about who we are as leaders in Virginia. But the picture isn't of one Virginia, it is of two Virginias, a white Virginia and a Black Virginia, existing in parallel along the same arc of history, frequently intersecting, but never running together as one. Two different experiences, born from the same beginning 400 years ago, and still never merged into one shared history. The white Virginia that's had its privilege to never deal with being treated as second-class citizens in public, or had to face institutional and cultural barriers that are higher than any wall that one could imagine. The Black Virginia that is acknowledged when convenient, that is viewed as monolithic, with one Black experience of poverty and lack of drive, who has suffered painful and visceral wounds that are often papered over or paid attention to for a couple of moments and then forgotten. The white Virginia that perpetuated segregation, massive resistance, the glorification of the Confederacy via monuments and flags in public spaces, and other mechanisms which consciously or unconsciously attempted to demonstrate its power over Black Virginians. The Black Virginia that is still oppressed by the vestiges of Jim Crow in our legal system, that fears law enforcement, is mocked in yearbook photos year after year after year, and looks skeptically at white Virginia because of generations past. I was born in 1989, just 8 months before the election of L. Douglas Wilder as our first Black governor. The first Black governor elected in this country. The grandson of slaves, this was supposed to be a watershed moment for our Commonwealth. One would have thought, and many would have hoped, that this election would have ushered in a state in Virginia that was not Black or white, but one Virginia, a united Commonwealth. However, it seems we haven't come far enough to understand the hurt and the pain and the effect of those who grew up in the shadow of separate but equal. 30 years on, throughout the duration of my life, we are still struggling mightily with race here in this state. Now, let me be abundantly clear. Black Virginia and white Virginia have no specific political party. These two Virginias have coexisted in inequality for 4 centuries, but we may now finally be reaching a tipping point. The lasting wounds of the two parallel journeys have been reopened, and now we as Virginians have a choice to give these deep-seated issues the attention of a news cycle and suppress our differences yet again, or to address these long-standing issues head-on and make real progress towards healing and reconciliation between Black and white Virginia. I believe deeply in my bones that we can walk together shoulder to shoulder for the good of this Commonwealth, but it will take a desire to address that which is uncomfortable and every ounce of compassion and understanding that we can summon from within ourselves. In Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. It is time for us as Virginians to recognize that we are now part of that single garment of destiny, whether we like it or not. We now have a chance to confront our demons head on and to realize that we are inextricably linked as one. We can try to connect white Virginia and black Virginia once and for all to acknowledge, confront, and understand each other's paths. No longer can we paper over our differences. For years, we have opted for Band-Aids when we have needed stitches. This is our shared Virginia journey that we can march on together. The arcs to this point have been different and must be acknowledged as such. But we are brothers and sisters under God, roaming the vast expanses of this Commonwealth, from the streets of the capital city to the suburbs of Northern Virginia, from the shores of Virginia Beach to the rolling hills of Southwest. We must understand that our path towards healing and reconciliation starts with us, as leaders of this state, the people who folks look to for guidance and leadership. That our words cannot ring empty with Black Virginia, that our deeds and aims in this body as policymakers must be reflected in our actions and our ideals. It is my firm belief that once we accept that responsibility, we can begin to heal and reconcile with one another, to bring these Virginias together onto the same track, onto that shared journey that embodies Dr. King's words in his letter. We have a choice to ignore what has happened and paper it over, or to face our challenges head on, acknowledge our incredibly different history with race in this state, and vow to move forward together. A failure to address this chasm between black and white Virginia is that the acceptance of the status quo, a Virginia that is divided through race, whether overt or covert, that leads to further pain, hurt, and despair in this state that we all love. Now, I do not stand here this morning to chastise or criticize the actions of every man or woman who has acted foolishly or maliciously even decades ago. Insensitivity to others means that I must believe in second chances and forgiveness. And that's why my family and my faith have always taught me. I feel strongly that the cure for the cancer of racism and discrimination is not gradualism. The need for change and justice is urgent and immediate, and the burden is on all of us to end the scourge of racism once and for all. I have internalized the struggle that my family has suffered for generations, just as every other Black Virginian has struggled as well, and I feel compelled to insert myself into this conversation so that I might be able to make a lasting difference in our state that has been moving in separate directions for far too long. I have faith that we can make the tough choice to tackle our history head on and move forward together to heal and reconcile. It is what my grandparents and parents have wished that we do for decades. As a young Black man in this fractured Commonwealth, I will do all that I can to make sure that their dream, our dream, comes true. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.